Today's reading is Numbers 27, 1 through 11. Then the daughters of Zelophehad came forward. Zelophehad was son of Zephyr, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, of the clans of Manasseh, son of Joseph. The names of his daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Haglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, saying, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the congregation of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the congregation of Korah, but he died for his own sin, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers." Moses brought their case before the Lord. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "The daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they're saying. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance among their father's brothers, and pass the inheritance of their father on to them. You shall also speak to the Israelites, saying, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall pass his inheritance on to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest kinsman of his clan, and he shall possess it. It shall be for the Israelites a statute and an ordinance, as the Lord commanded Moses." Let us listen to the words of the Bible today.
I think that there could be a subgenre of every genre of book or movie or TV show that is sibling drama. In our books, it's the Boxcar Children. Does anybody still read the Boxcar Children? Excellent, love it. I don't think I did. But the Hardy Boys, that was a book. Back there, and of course, a time-tested and maintaining favorite of Little Women. The story of 5 sisters who navigate a world that was built for men. Was it 4 sisters? Dang it! I don't think I read it, and I haven't seen the movie. Anyway, all right, there's 4 of them. They struggled, they strove, they grieved, they worked together, they sought their place in the world. And there are many reasons why this story has remained so important over the years that it's led to a new movie version every generation. And I think among the quality of writing and storytelling, one of the reasons is that we like stories of families and of siblings, and maybe because we can relate to them. Some people have lots of siblings and enjoy reading those stories of siblings the best they could be, of how they might relate to each other at their very best. Maybe. Our story today, the daughters of Zelophehad, is a story of sisters, of Mahlah, of Noah, of Haglah. See, I have this in here 3 times, so it'll be good. Of Milcah and of Tirzah. And it's a story that most of us have never heard. And it's a story that should be in our regular Sunday school rotations. Their names should be listed among the women of faith when we think of important stories of important women. We should know their names by heart. But often the ones we know by heart are the stories of women we vilified, of Jezebel or Delilah. both of whom I'm convinced at least a little bit did the things they had to do to survive in the world around them. It's another story. But these 5 sisters are named. We'll try it again. Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. They did something positive in a time of war and uncertainty and transition. The Hebrew people were standing outside of the promised land. They were figuring out how much land every tribe and every clan and every family would have. And then these 5 sisters passed into history. They had courage and strength, knowledge. They were rooted in their traditions, in their new law, so much so that they were able to challenge the leadership. They went up to Moses, and Moses took their question to God, and God declared them to be correct. These sisters stood before a congregation of leaders, all men, a crowd of thousands, and they set a precedent for the women who were to go after them. They set a precedent that the law as it was given might be good, but it wasn't going to be complete. It doesn't account for every little situation. There were going to be moments and times and situations when someone was going to need to stand up and name an injustice, whether it is built into the law or in this case, just neglected. Some people, like these sisters, were going to need to stand up and say something, to call it out and to name the injustice when they saw it. Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah stood together, an intimidating situation, and they called on their tradition, and they secured their future. And they secured a place for their father's clan in the future. And so if we really look at it, it's not perfectly feminist, at least not in modern feminism. They're not going to get to keep the land in their name. It will stay in their father's name, and they will marry, and it will be still named in their father's name, and they'll pass on to sons in the future, assuming there are sons in the future. And it didn't set a precedent that daughters were going to inherit alongside their brothers in the future, at least not yet. But it was a stepping stone. It is carrying on a tradition. It is honoring the family that had brought them to this place. It is caring for their ancestors, assuring their future and their presence, and preparing for their future. When the sisters stood before the council, they honored their past and they changed the future through the law and the land. This summer, we are telling stories, and so I would like to tell a few today. On the shoulder of these sisters, these daughters, stood Antoinette Brown Blackwell. She was the first woman ordained in the United States. Yes, mostly, but definitely within the root traditions and denominations that became the United Church of Christ. She was born in 1825 and told at the age of 8 that girls could not be ministers. But she was smart and she was determined, and she finished her basic schooling. She taught and she saved money, and she enrolled in the university where she studied literature until she wore them down and they finally admitted her into the theology department. She was vocal. She was involved in justice movements and cared for the well-being of women. She wrote about her knowledge of scripture and tradition of the past, that Paul's argument about women, against women speaking in the church, was really about context and excess and not actually about leadership. In 1850, she should have graduated and been given a license to preach, but the school withheld both. She preached anyway. And in 1853, the Congregational Church relented and ordained her. In her first appointment, her first church, it wasn't perfect. And it turns out it's going to take a lot of years for some churches to believe women can be ministers. So it didn't last long, but her ministry never ended. She worked with the temperance movements. She worked in the slums and prisons of New York. She studied the association between mental illness and poverty. She wrote books, and in the decades that followed, leading to the turn of the century, most other mainline denominations ordained their first women as well. And it wasn't perfect. In a lot of cases, there was a big gap between the first person and the long line of women who would be ordained. But rooted in the past, and she's securing her present, and she set the course for the future. And so even I stand on the shoulders of Antoinette Brown Blackwell. 120 years later, William R. Johnson, Bill Johnson, became the first openly LGBT, openly gay person to be ordained in the United Church of Christ and the country. The Bay Area churches in California did not need the same convincing that the East Coast churches did 100 years earlier. But there were some churches around the country that did. Bill continued to be in ministry, supporting the ordination of LGBT people, the full inclusion in the church, and changing the whole face of religion and queerness. Standing on the shoulders of Antoinette Brown and rooted in the history and tradition, standing with his community with a vision for the future, he stood with courage in front of the church and all of the country and named that there was an injustice. And he lived with the consequences, and he lived with the struggle for the future of the church. And so I stand on the shoulders of Bill Johnson. Now, there wasn't a time in my life when I didn't know, growing up, it didn't ever occur to me that women couldn't be pastors. My church always had a woman pastor, usually the associate. So that wasn't a job that I thought was unavailable to me. It was just one I didn't want. By the time I was in high school, I thought maybe I would be interested in working with youth in the church because I had great leaders, and one of them was Ellen. Ellen didn't grow up in the church. She had some hard times in her adulthood, a difficult marriage and divorce, difficult relationships. She was a single mom of her 2 kids by the time I met her. And she was discovering her call to ministry. And it started in youth ministry. And as the call in her life grew, it changed and evolved and progressed. And she answered that call by going back to school, by going to seminary, and being a United Methodist, by going the places where they sent her, from the north woods of Rhinelander to Brown Deer. Ellen is a mystic, meaning she is led by the Spirit that breathed life into creation and moved in the upper room at Pentecost and moved through the lives of mystics before her. When I was in a tough place and needed to set a new course for my life, it happens, as happens to all of us from time to time. And Ellen invited me to join her on a retreat into the woods where she sat me down with mandalas to color. And she looked at me and said, "So now you're going to seminary?" It wasn't a question. Being a mystic doesn't always go well in the face of an institution. So her ordination process was a bit of a struggle. But Ellen was rooted in her tradition, in the history, in the stories of those who had gone before her, in her call, and she would not be deterred. She had an eye to the future, that the church that she loved would be more welcoming to all and more spirit-filled. She was ordained and she continues to teach and serve in love and be moved in the Spirit. And I learned from her that the call in our lives will always change and grow. And I learned from her about the tenacity in the midst of struggle. And I learned from her about slowing down and listening to the Spirit, because she will not let us down. So I stand on the shoulders of Ellen. And these are stories that are meaningful to me, that have revealed the broadness that is the Church of Christ, and where I might find a home in it. These are the stories of folks who have paved the way for me, and that is what we are doing this summer. That is part of who we are as a church. We study the past and we honor our ancestors. We live and thrive in the present, and we set the course for those who will follow. We are to have a vision of longevity. We are to be stewards of time, of this time, of the history, and of the future for generations from now. We are to be caretakers of all that has been and setting a course for all that might be. We stand on the shoulders of these 5 sisters, of Mala, of Noah, of Hogla, of Milcah, of Tirzah, the daughters of Zelophehad, and we honor their place in our story of faith as lives lived faithfully that set a path for future generations. And we tell the stories of those who have set us on our paths too. Amen.